Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm the CEO of Collapse Survivor, and this was our 15th simulation scenario dealing with election violence and a form of civil war that results after the heated election. With me today is Willa, the head of marketing for Collapse Survivor. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Willa, and I just got onboarded with the Collapse Survivor app. I'm in charge of marketing, and I'm a prepper myself and very anti-government overreach. So it's a pleasure to meet all of you anonymous internet people out there.
Especially you, James. I'm just kidding. I don't know if there's a difference or not. We're both preparing for the inevitable, seeing what's going to happen, and hopefully there's not, we'll see. There's always a lot of stuff out there, a lot of things to be worried about right now. Civil war is one of them, and we have a guest survival expert with us today, Colonel Miller, who I will introduce in a few minutes. So we are going to cover the first day's development in this podcast, election violence in the 2024 POTUS election. Our guest wrote this scenario, and we will be talking to him about what happened in the scenario and what the preparedness lessons you can learn from this simulation. Willa, have you looked at the simulation?
I have looked at the simulation on the app. It's really interesting, and I think it's a really good idea that can get people really prepared in times of crisis in ways that they probably wouldn't have imagined prior. I think it's a really neat feature.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of things that people don't really think about that could happen. We're going to cover the first day's developments in this podcast, election violence in the 2024 POTUS election. Our guest, Colonel Miller, wrote the scenario, and we'll be talking with him about what happened in the scenario and where the preparedness lessons you can learn are from this simulation. This will talk a lot about like the political climate and how everything is kind of coming together, right? Like what are all the issues that we as a nation are facing. Awesome. Yeah, no. So Drew is a retired Air Force intelligence officer, a prepper, and a survival expert. Drew has founded and is the CEO of Fortitude Ranch, the nation's largest recreational and survival community, and he wrote the scenario for our app. Drew, can you give us a quick overview of the scenario and what happens?
Sure. Well, a lot of people are concerned that we've got a civil war brewing in the U.S. since our country is so divided. And so that's what plays out in this scenario. And that's what we do in the military. Again, the whole Collapse Survivor simulations are based on military training exercises, where if you want to get prepared for something, you got to practice it. Well, how do you practice a war? Well, you imagine a scenario and it's scripted, just like the message traffic we've been reading today in this first day of the 6-day Civil War scenario. So right now the election is getting more violent. Trump is behind 5% in the polls, we find out. And that's interesting because I wrote the scenario, weeks ago, and I just saw the latest poll and Harris is ahead by 5%. So far, this has been pretty accurate. And I hope it's not accurate because it ends up getting bad to the point where after the election, the U.S. starts to some degree coming apart, but it's not states fighting each other, not like the stupid Civil War movie that was out recently, but it's more like divisions within states, because really the divide is not so much GOP Democrat, it's more urban rural, liberal conservative, people who want big government takes care of you, socialism, in the Bernie Sanders model, versus libertarians and Republicans and conservatives who want minimum government, which is kind of what our Constitution was written for. So that's what happens in this scenario.
Yeah, no, it's there's all sorts of dynamics that are happening with this scenario, though. It's all of our scenarios are fictitious, right? But we do emphasize that the people who are writing them, they do need to be as realistic as possible. The items that are in the events are taken directly from events in the real world. Drew, can you talk more towards that
the poll that they mentioned in this message item? I mean, a large percent of the American public is concerned about a civil war, and that's what happens here. So in this scenario, what happened over the message traffic we just saw today was more election violence. Some of it's over the Democratic proposal for an AR ban, which millions of Americans just will not accept. There's demonstrations and counter demonstrations. And the problem with counter demonstrations is that tends to get more violent. So that starts heating up in the election scenario. And there were some other message items there with, some groups forming and then counter groups form against them, and things just kind of to get nastier, and violence just started breaking out there. And and a lot of us, have experienced it in our families. That's why this message item, I thought, from Tim Pool, a leading libertarian podcaster, was kind of a neat one. And I see this in my family, and I have tons of friends that say the same thing, that their families are really divided. You got Trump, absolute fanatics, absolutely love him, and you've got that within families. So we had this message item here where Tim Pool talks about it, and again compares it to the original U.S. Civil War, where families in some cases literally split up to go fight against each other.
Yeah. And so you've been on the Tim Pool show, have you not?
Yes, I've been on several times. It's interesting. Tim Pool he's a libertarian, but he's also, I would say, he's a prepper. He covers threats a lot that could cause a collapse, and the need to prepare for it. And it's kind of funny because I've seen a lot of videos produced condemning Tim Pool for talking about collapse threats and having preppers on his show. And to me, it kind of illustrates another divide in our country. Libertarians, we generally, I'm pretty much a libertarian. Libertarians tend not to trust the government. It's not that I think the government is full of evil people. They're not. But we realize that government can't help you in a collapse, and you need to be able to responsible do stuff on your own. On the other hand, a lot of left-leaning, very liberal Democrats are just the opposite. They want people to be dependent on government. They want you to trust in your government and assume the government will always take care of you. And that's not what libertarians and preppers believe. And there's a good example of this on your app. In May, I remember you sent out a threat alert on the solar flare. There was big solar flare activity, and a government agency reported on, hey, there's a big risk of a damaging solar flare, but there was no official government warning put out. Because again, the politicians, elected officials, the bureaucrats want all the people to just trust that government will take care of you. Well, the app put out a warning, not from a government source, but from an expert on the grid, that there was about a 10% chance, it was the best estimate of his estimate was a 10% chance that our grid could go down from that solar flare in May. And there was a little bit of damage, it didn't go down. But the alert went out on the Collapse Survivor app telling people, hey, it's unlikely, but there is a 10% risk of damage to the grid. And if the grid goes down, if there's a big solar event, if there's an EMP attack from a nuclear weapon, electromagnetic pulse, government studies, congressionally funded studies from experts have concluded that 90% of the population could die. So if there's a 10% chance of the grid going down, the government should have put out an alert on it, but they didn't, because they want people to just trust, nothing to worry about, government will take care of you. Well, the app reported on it, and Tim Pool covered the solar flare risk on his show. He had David Tice, a producer, who put out the fantastic documentary everyone should watch. It's called Grid Down, Power Up. It cites that 90% of Americans could die statistic in it, explains how vulnerable our grid is. Well, people need to know about that. So you need an app, and then you need people like Tim Pool warning about threats, because the government will not. The government wants you to be dependent, trust in the government. They'll take care of you, even though preppers know that that's just not the case.
There are a lot of situations that will happen like that, where if there's a 10% chance of something happening and like causing some real big damage, you're not really going to hear about it. The overseers are not necessarily, trying to volunteer that information that much. So
I think they don't want to elicit unnecessary panic unless they're like really sure, because if they start sending out alerts on their own and everyone starts panicking, everyone gets very mad very quickly at them, and they're trying to keep everyone happy. So I think they're trying to be very strategic and careful about alerting the population about real threats. And I understand that, but also when there is a real threat and they're too hesitant on the trigger, that can be life-threatening. So the app is a very good workaround for that, in my opinion, having an outside source to alert us of disaster where the government can't, because it would elicit so much panic, I'm actually a fan of Tim Pool myself. I've been following him since, I would say, maybe 2018, 2017. And something that I really like about him is he feels he's very pragmatic, and he doesn't get very emotionally worked up and stirred very easily. And even when he does get very emotionally stirred, it's not explosive or like ugly. He has a very good groundedness about him, and doesn't like to just, say things all willy-nilly. He's very deliberate in what he says, and I really appreciate that about him, because I think that it's a good, valuable resource that a lot of people could look at, being in the looking to the thought community, like podcasters, for information. It's really innovative, where there's a lot of censorship in like our normal news rotations. The podcasters come in and fill in those gaps. So I really enjoy the Tim Pool show.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he was in the media before he founded his show. He was a reporter. And I think he just got fed up because, the media is so dependent on the government for information. They tend to be just, cheerleaders for the government a lot. And I think he just got a little bit fed up with the lack of honest reporting. So went off and produced his own show. And then doesn't. On some issues, yeah, he's got a point of view, but most of the time when you go on a show, it doesn't matter that I'm a prepper. When I went on the show, he will challenge everyone on his show. He'll question you, and he's very analytical, gets into the issues, doesn't take sides, and when he sees a bias, he'll go after you on that. All his guests, and that's one reason it is kind of fun to watch, because anyone on that show can go in and grill. And they said, I've been on it twice, and yeah, I get grilled on that show. You get challenged. It's kind of fun.
And that's good journalism, quite frankly, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. With Donald Trump, we have been we have this and some other poll questions in the simulation. We won't have the results of this poll until later, but it's a question that many people have wondered about. Does Donald Trump running for re-election with the January 6th history and the bitter divide our nation faces makes more likely to experience some kind of civil war?
I think it does, but I don't know that it would be that grand. I think it might just cause risk for disorder and anarchy, but on small scales, not on like a wide mass, like everyone is taking up arms against each other. I think that risk is very small. I think that it does kind of create a risk, though, because he evokes a lot of emotional responses in people, whether they be positive or negative.
We did have another Civil War simulation that ran on the Collapse Survivor app earlier this year, and the majority answer was yes, that Donald Trump running for re-election could cause a civil war. We haven't seen anything too crazy so far, but hopefully it stays like that. But, people, it's something that people are thinking about. So there are also a lot of respondents who said that a civil war is coming regardless of Trump, right? The nation is just too divided right now is what some people, what other people have said as well.
Yeah, I might concur with that. I think that there's just been this buildup of emotional energy in the citizens. People are getting very fed up with everyone up top. And I think regardless of whether Trump was running or not, I think he makes it worse because, like I said, he elicits a very emotional response from people, albeit positive or negative. I think even if he wasn't there, there's still a risk because of just how much has happened in the last 8-12 years. So we'll see.
What's up?
But we'll see.
So this is a 6-day simulation. We've just completed 1 day, so I need to issue a spoiler alert. If you keep listening to this, you'll hear about things that are going to happen later this week as the election plays out. So if you want to be surprised, then stop listening to this video now, and we'll see you back on the next one. Else, I will ask Colonel Miller to talk about how and why a civil war develops post-election.
Okay, so in this scenario, Trump's behind by 5%, and they figure out they've got to do something to change the dynamics or they're going to lose. So what they do is they actually go libertarian. They announce that the Trump administration will enforce the 9th and the 10th Amendments, and we've got some slides later on that talk about those amendments. So basically, they limit government to not violating your natural rights, and the federal government can't do anything unless it is written out in the Constitution. And so what happens with that change is The libertarians go decisively for Trump. A majority of the independents now swing towards Trump. A lot of the conservative Republicans who have not been backing Trump now support Trump, not necessarily because they like him, but because they love the idea of giving limited constitutional government back, and Trump wins the election. Once he wins the election, things start falling apart in a lot of liberal states. California is basically a state with a Democratic-controlled, very liberal government in charge, huge taxes, and rural Californians hate that. They've talked about creating the Jefferson state and seceding from California. And you see the same thing in Oregon, where Eastern Oregon hates Portland and the big urban Democrats there. Same thing in Nevada, same thing in Colorado, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts. And what happens is these rural counties, basically, it's a civil war, a whole series of them, but within states. So it's not state fighting state. It's basically states kind of falling apart with rural counties. And again, our election divide is really less Democrat Republican than it is liberal, pro-government, urban against more rural, conservative, don't like big government Americans. That's really the political divide in the US. And that's exactly what plays out in this scenario. So when you see in this slide example here, California starts talking about secession from the United States, but at the same time, there's other message traffic about all kinds of internal conflict going on in California. So again, it's a 5% election disadvantage that causes Trump to say, the Trump campaign, to try to change the dynamics of the election away from this debate and back to things like, how do we limit government? How do we get our Constitution back? And a number of things occur that succeed for them in getting the libertarian, conservative, and independent votes over to Trump's side, and a change in the dynamics of the election so that he wins in November. So this is the 9th and the 10th Amendment, and I know you've got some guests on later this week who are going to talk about this a lot. But basically, the 9th Amendment says that we have natural rights. That's what the American Revolution was fought for, natural rights like privacy, property, that are violated all the time by government. But the 9th Amendment, which is part of the Bill of Rights, basically says that just because the Constitution doesn't list a right, like freedom of press, freedom to bear arms, the Second Amendment, just because it's not listed doesn't mean it's there. You still have those natural rights. That's the 9th Amendment, which courts don't even try to enforce in the United States. It's like the 9th Amendment does not exist in our Constitution. That's how horrible our legal system and political system is today. And then the 10th Amendment is very clear, absolutely clear in the Federalist Papers and all the constitutional debates. It was absolutely clear that unless a power is written out in writing in the Constitution that says the government can do a postal service, the federal government cannot. Unless it says the federal government can maintain an army and make foreign policy, it cannot. That's what the 10th Amendment says. So healthcare is absolutely, completely illegal. It's not authorized in the Constitution. And there's all kinds of examples from it. I'm not getting into the details today. I know you've got a guest later on who will talk about, for example, there's a 1937 Supreme Court case where basically FDR threatened the Supreme Court and they backed down. They basically erased the 10th Amendment and said, you know what? You can do whatever you want, federal government. We're not going to declare laws unconstitutional anymore for violating the 10th Amendment. It's grossly wrong, but that's the way it's been. And libertarians are aware of that, a lot of conservative Republicans, but it's something that 95% of Americans really aren't that aware about. There's the 10th Amendment Center does a good job trying to promote it. Libertarians do. And in this scenario, the Trump administration now jumps on the 9th and 10th Amendment bandwagons and rides that to success. There is a paper, I wrote this scenario, and this is a paper I wrote that talks about how did this happen. It talks about that 1937 Supreme Court case where FDR pressured him to basically erase part of the Constitution. And if you go to the website, you can download the paper and read more about that. So at this point, I think we want to switch to survival preparedness lessons learned. And there were quite a few of them, but the biggest one is the one listed here. You know, when anytime the police are tied up, looting and marauding can take off because there just aren't police available to respond. They're at crowd control. they're controlling the counter demonstrations, as we saw in this scenario.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have seen this lesson in some previous scenarios where there have been big protest events, and the police have to deploy a crowd control and keep our counter protesters separated and nonviolent. Well, when this happens, police are stretched thin and overwhelmed.
Yeah. And gangs know about this. I mean, if you're a professional criminal and you know that there's something going on, you can move. You saw it in Portland. There'd be legitimate protests going on in Portland in recent years, and yet other people, and I'm not saying they're the protesters, I'm not criticizing the causes of people who are protesting there, but people know if you start breaking into stores now and dozens, hundreds of people start falling in the stores, there's almost no way you're going to get arrested. And our criminals know that. Absolutely.
There's everywhere there's opportunists. Not everyone, in my opinion, is an opportunist, but it's kind of ingrained in us as humans to look for opportunities where we can gain something. And in any instance, a good example of this is when there's like a major accident and there's a whole bunch of cops, and you kind of know, okay, I can speed because all the cops are at that accident. The same thing would happen if there was mass civil unrest and all of the cops were tied up. Opportunists immediately are going to take that opportunity and go do other crimes elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. And I know the city that I live in, there's 74, what is it? 74. I actually don't even know.
It's like 84
total cops. And, they're not all working at once, and, so there's a fraction of that working every day. Let's take this to, if something like this happened, and there wouldn't be that many people to help protect these stores and everything else. So
no, absolutely not. They had to even call in the state police a couple years ago because they needed extra manpower, and crime is rampant in that city. Absolutely rampant because of that exact reason. They're so understaffed. There's no way that I've called the cops several times in that city, and it's always a 3-hour wait at the very minimum for anyone to show up.
I've heard somebody who got their car stolen, and there's a lot of carjackings there, but it's rare that they'll find a car or that they'll even pursue that, because it's just,
they have so much other stuff going on, like organized crime with the cartels in Mexico. There's a lot going on there. Absolutely. And they're way too short staffed. Transferring that to like civil unrest, same thing. If everyone is in the inner city, all of the outskirts are just going to get torn up.
There is a simulation that we ran recently on flash mobs, which are basically another way to overwhelm police by having dozens or more flood into stores and start looting, which is a realistic scenario in California many times. But you can watch this Lessons Learned podcast on this topic, which includes several practical tips on how to avoid getting harmed if you're caught in a flash mob or out of control big protest situation. Drew, thanks for joining us. I'm excited to see what happens next in this simulation. Thanks for writing it, and appreciate you being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan and Willa, for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it.
And remember, everyone, to keep your Collapse Survivor app on your phone, even if you don't want to play the simulation, so you get real, potentially life-saving threat alerts. When a virus starts spreading, or big solar flares taking out the electrical grid, or some other disaster is likely or starting, the sooner you know, the more time you have to get to a safe place and raise your odds of survival. Our app costs just $10 a year, encouraging everyone you know to have this app on the phone. Whether or not you want to use the training simulations or other preparedness features, the threat alerts can save your life. And be sure you're subscribed to the app. If you have downloaded the app but are not subscribed, the app will not function, and it won't send you the threat alerts. There's a 30-day free trial available when you sign up and subscribe, and then it's just $10 a year. And I think that's a cheap price to pay for improving your odds of survival.
After the end of this 6-day training simulation, a lessons learned report will be published and then posted to the collapsesurvivor.com website. Tomorrow, for our day 2 Civil War training simulation, our guest is a retired Army general. So make sure to join us for that.